Hey, welcome to episode 266 of Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for pressing play. I'm always glad to have you along for the crazy ride with me. This episode, we're talking with Neal Hallford. He's been on the show several times. This time, we're talking about the very famous, groundbreaking computer role-playing game Betrayal at Krondor. It's the 30th anniversary, so Neal spins some good yarns about the game and the background on the game and the just absolute craziness and shenanigans around trying to get the sequel made and weird stuff that was done and Machiavellian things that were done to him. And I'm not exaggerating. You'll hear as you get in there and listen. There's also a couple of fan events. There's a get together and then it's in person, and there's also an online get together. And there's a fan film challenge around Betrayal at Krondor. These are all to celebrate the 30th anniversary, and those are at towards the end of the show is when we really dig into those. So if the main reason you're listening is to get those details, just want to make sure you're aware of that. And on that note, you can always go to the show notes for this episode at shaneplays.com, and there'll be links in there. So if there's more you want to dig into, or if you're like, what were they talking about? I didn't catch that detail, then go to the show notes at shaneplays.com and there'll be plenty of links and helpful stuff there. Don't forget, last episode was a big one. That was They Came for the OGL. Third-party RPG publishers share their experience. That's when we had Zach Glazer from Frog God Games, Bill Barsh from Pacesetter Games, and Levi Combs from Planet X Games talking about all the crazy ridiculousness with the OGL fiasco and drama and craziness that came out of Wizards of the Coast. So if you missed that and that interested you at all, it's a cool episode because there are a lot of people covered the facts of the situation incredibly well. But this episode goes more into how did it affect these people and their employees and their companies and all this stuff. And it is really, really fascinating, good conversation. So check that out. Episode 265, They Came for the OGL. And insert Scream Queen screaming at the monster in the distance there. So one last thing, I don't really talk about my Patreon or any of that a lot for this show. I do have one. There's a note at the end of every episode that talks about it. I really don't ask a lot for support or anything for the show. If people want to, I'm glad for them to. And I'm sure you've heard other podcasts and YouTube channels ask for this. If wherever you listen to it, if you could leave a review, that does help me. I noticed recently I had eight reviews on Apple Podcast or iTunes Podcast, whatever, and that felt good. And if you're one of the people that listen to the show on YouTube, I do post just the audio of each episode on YouTube. If you could, leave a thumbs up or even a thumbs down or a comment, that helps me tremendously. That really does affect things. Anyway, other than that, buckle up. And here we go with Neal Hallford and Betrayal at Krondor.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes. I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky all up in your podcast. It's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for pressing play. And on the show this time around is a friend of the show. Neal, it's Neal Hallford. But Neal, I went back and looked. You've been on the show several times for several reasons. More than once you came on just to geek out for geeky news. You've come on and talked about today's topic is mainly going to be about Betrayal at Krondor, the magnificently received and well-loved computer RPG that it's hitting its 30th anniversary. We'll be talking about today. You're also on with our mutual friend David Beatty at least once, talking about Mega Wars, his game Mega Wars, which is now Galaxicus, if I remember correctly. So He's still out there doing that. But the point is, you're a friend of the show, but it's been a while since I've had a chance to talk with you. So welcome back.
Well, yeah, it's great to be back. I always enjoy a chance to kind of hang out with you and talk about stuff because we have so many kind of shared geekery things in common, and our conversations tend to go all over the map. So I enjoy that enormously.
Yeah, it's fun. We've half jokingly, half seriously talked about doing a geeky podcast called Magnesium Planet Explosion because of the Magnesium Planet explosion that happened at the Con of Wrath, the Wrath of Khan Star Trek convention, these many years ago. So taking us to Betrayal at Krondor, that's what we're here for. You were instrumental in the story, and I don't know how they put it, scenario design, level design.
So, well, of course, back then, of course, today the terms for these sort of things are fairly well defined. But back in the day, I was a designer, with designer slash writer. And of course, John Cutter was the lead designer on the project, but he was also technically a producer, even though they weren't really calling people producers yet at that point. That was still something that sort of came along.
Yeah, he's got a credit as director.
Yeah, director. He's the director of it because they were definitely thinking about things in sort of movie terms at the time.
So did he have like a megaphone? Was he running around with a megaphone?
He had a megaphone, and he also had those jodhpurs.
Yeah, right. He had a little director's chair he would fold out.
Little beret.
Yeah, the beret. Oh
yeah. But anyway, so I was technically designer slash writer, but in terms of the production of the game, I was writer, but also sort of co-lead designer on it, because John and I, just because of the size and the scope of the game, particularly as we rolled along, there was, John was spending a lot of time also wearing a producer hat, and so John's making all of the big decisions about the main kind of systems in the game, but I was doing a lot of the stuff in terms of when I'm writing stories and saying, okay, here's a scenario, that's going to happen in the game, and so that would be event design or level design. So, and then as we got further into the project, we were pulling up people from QA and kind of elevating them to basically what would be junior designers now. And so we had 3 other folks that came up from QA for us. It was first we had Timothy McClure Tim McClure, and then we had Chris Mettinger and Joseph Munich. And so those guys the 3 of them were really kind of responsible for taking a lot of the stuff that John and I were working on and developing, and they're down in the trenches and saying, okay, well, this dialogue needs to come up at this point. So they're down in the code and putting in the tags around, so that it'll show up, so whenever you knock on this house, here's the message that's going to pop up, or whenever you open up a chest, well, the chest is located here, and then working in the tile editor. So they're doing all the really hard grunt work of trying to make all of the crazy stuff that John and I are coming up with function. That's
definitely beyond the normal QA job description.
And so
would have been, well, can you give me those names again? The reason I'm asking is because I've got the credits page for Betrayal at Krondor pulled up on GameSpot.
So Tim McClure is the first name. So he was someone from QA who actually got the official promotion, became a junior designer. Then the other 2 were Chris Mettinger and Joseph Munich, and they were still technically QA, even though they were basically doing design jobs towards the ends of the project.
The reason I wanted you to throw their names out again, because they're on the credits page I'm looking at here, their names did not make the credits, so I just want to make sure that they got their names thrown out there.
They were in QA, and they were, and again, but again, they really should have been regarded more than QA. Because they were doing really hardcore stuff.
It sounds like it. Yeah.
But anyway, so that's sort of titles and hats and everything or whatever. But story was, of course, I was the muckety muck in charge of driving the story. John Cutter and I came up with the overall, sort of what the the overall plot was going to be. I did all of the subplots and all of the crazy tiny things. Occasionally, John would step in and he wrote several of the house messages. So whenever you would knock on doors and in some of the houses, he did a lot of things there. And then, of course, also there was Ray Feist, who is the New York Times bestselling author that we licensed his universe. Now, of course, Ray's name is on the outside of the box, and for numbers of years, people always talked about, wow, Ray's game is, talking about the story in the game, and we're set in his universe, but Ray didn't actually write any of it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, he did the world building. He
Yes.
did some of the other stuff, that the story relied on. But yeah, you wrote the story. And I think I was watching to kind of get ready to talk with you today. I installed the game and was playing around with it to kind of get a feel for it again. And then I was watching. I didn't get to watch the whole thing, but I was watching your interview that you just did with David Dawson on intellectual entertainment. And and I think I've heard you share this anecdote before, but you shared it again on the podcast with David Dawson on intellectual, where I guess Origin. No, it wasn't. Was it Sierra Online? Dynamics. It was Dynamics.
Well, it was developed at Dynamics. Our publisher was Sierra Online.
Well, somebody from one of those two companies, I'm going to assume Dynamics, went to Raymond E. Feist and said, "Hey, do you want to write this game?" He said, "You can't afford me."
Yeah.
So, and then you said, "But they could afford me."
Mm-hmm.
So you went from living 2 doors down from Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love in L.A. and ended up in was it Oregon?
Yes. I had been living in my brain just went dead.
Yeah, was it Van Nuys?
Van Nuys, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
You're welcome. Well, I just watched the interview.
I was just living. I was living in Van Nuys, and so whenever John and I had worked together at a game company called New Roll Computing. For game folks, that's they're best known for Might and Magic. And I worked some on Might and Magic 3, another RPG called Planet's Edge. But so John and I had briefly were at New World Computing at the same time. Dynamics hired him away about 6 months before I went up there, and then when John was there whenever they got the license for Feist, and he immediately called me and he says, "I want you to do the writing on that," because he and I had really kind of become very simpatico while working at New World Computing, and he thought I would be a good fit for that. So Jeff Tennell had been reading Silverthorn and decided to buy the Midkemia license, and
Midkemia being the
name of the world, the universe that Raymond E. Feist's Riftwar novels are written in.
And let's use the Wayback Machine, the time machine, and take, because some people don't know really what we're talking about. So Betrayal at Krondor was a very popular computer role-playing game, still highly regarded, still played by people. You can find Let's Plays and stuff out there, plenty of them. You can get it on goodoldgames.com, get a legal copy on goodoldgames.com, GOG. But at the time, in the mid 80s, early 90s, the Riftwar Saga books by Raymond E. Feist were very popular. I think it started with Magician Apprentice, then Magician Master, and it was Silverthorn, the third one. I can't remember.
So yeah, of course. Technically, whenever he first published Magician, it was all under one cover. But they decided after a few years is say that this is too long. So whenever they went to publish the paperbacks, they split it into half. And so yes, it started off as Magician, or it became Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. And of course, now they're back under one cover again. But for a period of about 10 years, they were the first book was split in half, and so the order are Magician Apprentice, Magician Master, Silverthorn, A Darkness at Sethenon, and those are the Riftwar quote proper novels. Now there are later books that are set in the same universe, but they're considered as part of a different period or whatever.
So these books were very popular. They were,
Yes.
in the 80s. Now you had a lot of fantasy out there. I'm not talking about pulp. I'm not talking about Conan and, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and any of that other, I love that fantasy, but I'm talking about what I would consider like high fantasy, epic high fantasy. So you had Tolkien, you had Terry Brooks doing his,
Yep.
was it
With Tolkien
Shannara?
with the serial numbers scratched off. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, yes and no. I recently read those, and yes and no. I mean, they start off very Tolkien, but he kind of goes his own ways. But yeah, stuff like Al-Anon is basically Gandalf, and you've basically got the Dark Lord
Well,
sending out
if you really want, basically, it's Lord of the Rings, but with the serial number scratched off of it. You want Dennis L. McKiernan's books,
Now
because
those I haven't read.
There were a trilogy of books that he did, and seriously, I mean, you could tell that he had gone to the Tolkien estate and said, "I want the rights to write in this
They told
universe,"
him
and they
no.
said no, and so he just went back and changed names, and so he writes these 3 books that, for all intents and purposes, it's the Lord of the Rings.
So instead of them being halflings or hobbits, they were half-bits?
They
Is
were
that how
they
you
were
do
I
it?
can't remember, but I mean, it's like the little short people with, like, the big things. They had large gem-like eyes, and there's the elves, and there is one sequence that it is the whole situation with the creature in the lake in front of the mines of
Right.
Moriah.
Right.
He writes that scene almost, you know,
To a
almost
T.
to a
Wow.
T, and it's just like,
Wow.
how did he get away with that?
Get away with this.
Um, but
I had never heard that, but
Dennis McKiernan, and they're actually good books. I
yeah,
enjoyed
but they're
them,
just so similar,
but it's
right? They're
just like,
so
oh, come
derivative
on.
or whatever. Yeah.
um,
Well, it's kind of like when a big popular movie comes out, there's always a knockoff movie that, so maybe he's just like, I'm not proud. I'm going to write this and have fun with it. So, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. So the original point was you had you had stuff like Tolkien, you had Brooks, you had some other stuff out
there
there.
was Eddings, who was
David
David
Eddings with the
Eddings was great,
Belgariad and all that.
and
Very good
was
stuff.
it Farland or whatever, that was also really big back in the day. But these were the major league, before we get into Brendan Sanderson or any of these other folks. These are the huge heavy hitters that are doing fantasy.
Right. So that's the point I was getting to. So the Riftwar Saga by Feist was a major. I mean, people still read it, I'm sure, but I mean, it was a big property.
Yes.
So you got Feist, who said, you can't afford me, and so you got to step in, and it made a very popular computer role playing game. But like you were saying, it was like, oh, this is written so well. That was actually all you. Feist's name was basically on it, which is fair. It's his property, right? Uh, but yeah, your writing was so good and your plotting was so good. I think most people just assumed that it was him doing all the writing.
Well, I mean, of course, it was even beyond assuming, because that was obviously what we were pushing.
Right.
Whenever, because marketing is saying, "Well, we got Raymond E.
Well, if you have a book based on a Stephen King or a game based on a Stephen King book, you'll probably want to market it like Stephen King wrote it.
Yeah.
Even though there's a guy in the background basically ghostwriting it.
They've got Ed.
Yeah, but at least, you got Ed. But at least in your case, I mean, you're very prominently in the credits for story and all that stuff. So they didn't try to hide you.
No.
They just didn't trumpet you either.
No.
But the point was, one thing that,
and nobody would have bought it, or nobody would have been as interested in it as saying, "And here's a game from Neal Hallford." Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's
and
great.
what's
Yeah.
that to me?
But your writing was so good that people just assumed it was Feist writing it. And then also, if I remember right, Feist incorporated some of your stuff into one of his, like Krondor the Betrayal or something like that? Or
the next trilogy of books that he wrote, in which starts off with Krondor the Betrayal, which was basically a novelization of the game. That and if you look actually in the thank you of that book, in the acknowledgments, and also in the dedication, he says just straight out, John and I wrote that game.
yeah,
and
and that's not, because he didn't have to do
no,
that.
he didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But also, and some of the other thing too is that there was a sequel game called The Thief of Dreams that I wrote. We were going to make a sequel, and then madness happened at Dynamics, where we ended up getting the sequel ended up getting canceled. But Ray still had his hands on that story, and so some of that story ends up filtering into the next two books that he developed after Krondor the Betrayal. That came out.
I mean, that has to
that
feel
plot.
good.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I
if
mean,
it felt right off, I
yeah.
mean, it's the nice thing about it is that Ray could have completely ignored us, and what we did,
Right.
but we became canon. So
That is cool. Yeah.
So he's got Janie Wirtz that he co-wrote 3 books with, that about the Empire series. That kind of happened at the same time as the Rift War, and so they are they're connected to that universe. But so I'm some sort of the other person that owns a piece of the canon for Midkemia. At least in terms of having created, I don't actually own it, so I don't have the license.
So I just wanted to give you kudos for that. That's no small feat. Also, one of the things that struck me when I loaded up the game again and was playing it, I'm sure you hear this a lot, and I'm sure it's come up in interviews and stuff, but that is it feels like playing a novel. Not that sometimes people will say that and it's an insult, like there's too much text here, but there's little text boxes that you might be walking down the road and something will pop up, or you'll go to haggle with a merchant, or and you get these wonderful little written moments.
And
It feels a lot like a novel.
Well, and
being
it
in the
is.
novel.
I
Yeah.
mean, it
Yeah.
really and truly is because whenever John and I were sitting down and starting to figure out what this game was going to be, we said we are adapting a novelist, and a big part of what makes the game, what makes this universe the universe is not just, okay, here's this character and here are these places and locations and histories that are there. Obviously, all of those things can be portrayed in the same way that they would be a movie, but also part of that experience is that reading Ray's books and you are kind of sucked into the authorial voice of Feist. And we said part of connecting them and really making them feel like this is part of Ray's world is we set out from the beginning and said this will be an interactive novel. It's a novel that you play. And so that was sort of a creative conceit that we started off at the very beginning. It's broken into chapters. It has a little chapter at the beginning of every chapter. There is a written thing of text along with kind of a little early cinematic kind of thing that's there. And as you said, there are a lot of encounters that are just purely text. But all of that was trying to reinforce the idea of this literary connection to the original books and to the gameplay. And so it's kind of funny because I tell people sometimes is that I did a word count on the amount of text that the player actually ever sees, and there's more text in it than Ray's longest novel at the time.
That's interesting. But like I said, if people haven't played it, it's very much a game. I mean, there's a lot of action, there's a lot of moving around, there's a lot of exploring stuff, but you just, in addition to the intros to the chapters and stuff like that, you'll get like when you're looting a body, it'll pop up and go like, I kind of feel bad about, is it Owen? I can't believe I'm forgetting.
It's probably Owen.
Whoever the magician is that they.
Owen's the one that's with you most of the time. There's this Patras who shows up later, but Owen's who's with you most of the time.
Owen was like, Owen felt bad about looting the newly dead corpse, but he's like, it doesn't have any use for it anymore. So you're still looting the corpse and dragging stuff off of it, but there's all these nice little literary moments sprinkled on top of it. Another thing that strikes me after playing it again, I probably played a couple of hours just to get a feel for the game again.
Mm-hmm.
Is for this came out is it 93?
So yes.
When did it come out?
So it came. So its launch date was June 23rd, 1993.
So it's a 30-year anniversary, and that's going to tie into a contest you're doing and some other events to tie in one of the things we're going to talk about today. But so this game came out 30 years ago, which in computer role-playing game terms and in video game terms is quite a while back technology-wise and design-wise. And this game, they paid off, okay? But this game made some very bold choices in design. You had the 3D where you're walking around and you basically, I heard you talking to David Dawson. I probably read other places you mentioned this. You adapted flight simulator technology
Yes.
to allow the characters to walk around in 3D. When you go into combat, the way that the enemies and your characters are laid out next to each other and how they can move and in relation to each other and fight was very unique, very bold. The literary thing you mentioned, very bold. When you go into a city, you hover around and click on buildings to get in and and as you move your mouse around and say, well, you can sell or you can leave or you can and that was kind of adventure game-ish.
Yeah.
Moved into a CRPG.
Yeah, that was.
So I'm saying
that was of course, so one of the problems that we had, it's kind of ironic because that all the little tiny what would essentially be villages end up being 3D buildings in the game. But the big cities like Krondor and Malik's Cross and some of these other places are painted backgrounds. And the main issue is that in order to create Krondor, you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of buildings that need to be explorable, and that there's no way that we could have done that even remotely any justice with the game engine that we had. Krondor would have been a half dozen or more zones just by itself, and even at that, trying to squeeze all those buildings in or whatever just we couldn't have done it. And so it was a creative thing we had to say. It said, well, we want to kind of capture what Krondor is visually, and so we would have these beautifully all the backgrounds that were done for the big cities. So like say Malik's Cross and Krondor and Sarth and some of these other places were all painting these beautiful paintings. I wish I still had the original paintings. I mean, it's you go back and I look at these, the way they are in the game now, and they're all pixely and everything else. But the original boards were just gorgeous. And so if you've seen the cover of Betrayal at Krondor, it has this amazing painting, and so the same guy that did that cover did the paintings of the little towns, of the town paintings, and again, so it's just incredible, but the detail and, like I say, just visually very striking. But anyway, so in that particular case, of course, being that we were a subsidiary of Sierra Online, and what Sierra Online was best known for back in the days, they were the kings of adventure games.
In the 80s and a good part of the 90s, adventure games were a major genre in video games.
More so than RPGs were back in the day.
Yeah, they were a top genre. They're still out there and people still play them, but they were a major genre of video games at the time.
Well, and that's thanks to Ken and Roberta Williams, and Roberta Williams in particular. But then, there were also, several other wonderful people that came out of Sierra. There were the Gabriel Knight series that were there, the Laura Bow series. And so, again, so So some of that mentality kind of filtered down to us when we were trying to figure out how to solve certain problems in Krondor. And it's kind of funny because we have the label as an RPG, and that was certainly the way that we were thinking about it internally. But in a lot of respects, it's actually a hybrid between an RPG and an adventure game. We don't start the game by rolling up characters, for instance.
Right, you just jump in.
We know,
with your
so we give
character.
you what
Yeah.
you know in a tabletop would just be called, here are some pre-gens.
But they're critical to the story.
They're critical to the story.
So
we couldn't
right,
tell
you're
this
playing
game.
characters in a novel.
Yeah, you're playing characters in a novel, and so they're pre-generated, and they each kind of represent certain classes. And so you have Gorath and Locklear. Gorath is definitely a warrior kind of person. We have Jimmy the Hand, who's definitely a rogue. You have Locklear that's sort of in between. You got the magic users who are Patris and Owen. And so even though we didn't have a rigid class and level system like you have in a typical D&D RPG kind of circumstances, we still kind of followed a lot of the same rules for how they operated, how they were in combat.
Well, it's obvious when you look at their skills.
Yeah.
Because right off the bat, Locklear has a higher pick locks.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think it was Locklear.
Well, you're Jimmy the Hand, James.
Well, no, I'm talking about the characters you start with.
Yeah. But yes, So Locklear's got, he's spent some time with Jimmy the Hand, so he's,
right.
So he's.
Yeah, at the very beginning, you can kind of look at the skills and say, okay, I see the role that they fit into, even though it doesn't say cleric or thief or, whatever. Anyway, so you've got, and kind of going back, and I'm glad to be having this discussion because when I had you on in 2016, believe it or not, to talk about Betrayal at Krondor, and you were doing sort of your personal passion project of remastering, I think, the first chapter in Lumberyard, Amazon Lumberyard, the game engine they were releasing at the time. That's when you came on when I was on the radio. So we had like 50 something minutes to talk.
Yeah.
And there was a news segment as well.
Right.
So we didn't really get to talk about Krondor itself. So I'm glad that this time around we're getting to dig more into the game. And if people like computer role-playing games at all, if you haven't played it, go play Betrayal at Krondor. If you consider yourself a computer role-playing game aficionado and you haven't played it, even just go play like the first chapter or something just to play the whole thing through, please. But if anything, just play the first chapter to get a feel for how this game was innovative and Neal's writing. But yeah, I noticed that it's a really easy to understand shorthand, which I think is a result of good game design. Because if it's intuitive to the player, then that means it was good game design, and there could have been hours of discussion behind the scenes leading to it. But it feels natural. It's very apparent from early in the game that if I go to a city and I've got to click around on a picture to go places, then that's a city big enough to have that. And if I'm just walking around out in the wilderness and I find a bunch of houses, then that's a small town. And it was just very intuitive and easy to understand that. Because the first time you go up to a house and it turns out to be a shop, you're like, oh, I'm in a little village. And then it just feels very natural. And then you just move on from there. But yeah, there's all these little houses. You just want to touch all the houses to see what happens. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes a lady will come out and run you off. Sometimes a shopkeeper.
We try to tell little stories, and we're also kind of playing with the irony of the fact that you're just, you have this big mission that you're having to accomplish or whatever, but you're out like knocking on people's doors.
Yeah, you're knocking on people's doors and poking everything with a stick. And I love you put in some dialogue that it said something. This lady was like, oh, I got to hurry up and get these mushrooms over. This was in Zug. I think the name of the village is Zug. And it said, or Guz or something. It was one of the first little villages you encounter and going south towards Krondor. and the lady said something weird like better eaten than dead or something like that, and in like it was a proverb,
Mhm.
and your character is like, well, that doesn't make any sense, and she's like, yeah. And she goes, yeah, I know. It's just something the Baron used to say,
Mhm.
you know. And then it was just like, and then there's no further explanation. So I love
And
little moments like that.
occasions like that, I'm actually pointing back at things that Ray writes in his books. And
Yeah,
so particularly for people who have read, now the thing about it is you don't have to have read Ray's books to understand what's going on in the game.
I think
But
that's
if
fair.
you
Yeah,
have, if you have read the books, there will be lots of little Easter eggs of things that I mention or happen in passing. That's kind of nice because it's just like, oh, okay, I know what they're kind of referring to, or we're kind of winking at something that happened in Ray's books.
right.
But
Well, it's yeah, it's good stuff. Well, another thing I love is that Locklear is like, and this is this is just due to the limitations of time and game design
mhm,
30 years ago, because we talked about when you came on a few years ago to talk about Betrayal at Krondor, you know, your
mhm,
remaster project, which was a personal project,
yeah,
not a
no,
commercial
nope,
product. Got to be very clear on that.
yep,
You were talking about how like newer game engines have draggable dialogue option trees that make things a lot easier.
mhm,
Uh, so back in the day, sometimes you would have encounters that didn't make sense just because you didn't have enough dialogue tree or
yeah,
encounter tree logic to deal with it. So Locklear is like, tell no one who we are. Don't let anyone know who we are. We're totally undercover. I got to get Gorak to Krondor.
mhm,
And then he'll go into a city and see a friend, and
mhm,
he's like, "Hey, it's me, Locklear, and how's it going?" You know, and this dwarf is like, "I haven't seen you since you were a lad," and so it just leads to funny little moments like that.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, when you're on the main road, Locklear's like, "Shh, shh, don't. Your name
This
isn't even
They're
Owen."
assassins. They're assassins. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's assassins around.
And of
Yeah, but
course,
if he goes to a
and
go
Thorgath.
ahead.
So in sort of Gorath, there's an
Yeah,
elf named Thorgath. Yes.
Thorgath instead of Gorath. Yeah. So yeah, and I love how the Owen's friend who was at a party with him the night before comes running up. Hey, how's it going? Owen, like, you know, trumpeting.
Mhm,
What are you doing? I figured you'd be going to this town, you know, and Locklear's over there chewing his own lips off.
mhm,
So uh anyway, uh but that leads into I'm not getting in I'm getting into the game design part of it.
mhm,
Like if you were making Betrayal at Krondor 30 years later today, you might have had the time and resources to adapt the interactions inside the cities to the Locklear was trying to be all, you know, quiet and stuff like that. So I certainly don't want you to take that as I'm critiquing
oh
the
no,
game.
no.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously the the there's so many things that that I would probably go back and change or fix or whatever. Because a lot of the questions that came up whenever I started fiddling around, and I just wanted to kind of quickly, for since you've already mentioned it or whatever, I want to kind of talk to people about it a little bit. Is the Krondor remastered thing that I was doing a few years ago? This was purely me trying to teach myself tools in Lumberyard and how to use that
right.
engine. And so I was just kind of starting off. I apologize. I got a car outside the window here, so I hope that's not causing problems.
I
But
didn't even hear
okay,
it.
all right,
It must be an
all right.
assassin car
Assassin
because I
car, yeah.
didn't hear it.
So so anyway, but so I was using Lumberyard, and I said, well, why not just grab or just think about, say, recreating certain things from Betrayal at Krondor as something so that I can teach myself the tools that they had available in the Lumberyard engine. And so this never turned into something that you could go download or grab. It wasn't something you could go buy. And so, because periodically people say, well, how's where can I get whatever, or how's that project going or whatever? And I said, this was a short term thing that I was doing just for my own amusement. And I shared some videos from that stuff. I also did later on. I did some stuff where I actually built out some of the how I imagined some of the ends might have looked like, and some stuff in 3D, and I was messing with Blender. But This is not a remake in terms of, like I say, not something you can go out and play with. I showed screenshots, I
Right.
shared some videos and stuff, but this is not something you can go play or get your hands on. I'm sorry.
Well, I think you tried to be clear on that at the beginning, but people get
People
excited,
get excited about it,
right?
and also too
Yeah,
is word gets passed around, and we play telephone, and suddenly I'm
right.
remaking the entire game, and we're doing a trilogy. Uh, it's just
Well,
some
what
stuff
I
that happens, and
remember,
so
and I have an unfair advantage because I went and listened to our podcast interview from 2016 again to get ready to talk today to get back up to speed. Um, and you were like, no, I think I may do some Patreon stuff, videos to kind of show people what I'm doing, to kind of help show how I'm learning lumberyard. Uh, I think your personal goal at the time was to maybe
yeah,
do
yeah.
the first
My plan
chapter.
was to try to recreate the first chapter, and it was more about,
Right,
in order to build the first chapter of the game, the one thing that boils down to is you're not that it goes beyond just modeling the houses, or putting in trees and all that other stuff. That is, create the entire game system. you
right.
know, um, which is a gigantic. And of course, I am not a programmer. I can do some scripting and some things like that, but I am not a programmer, and so I'm trying to do the work of what took a core of us 30 people to do basically 2 years to
Right.
do, and on top of that. They have all these specialties that they're bringing to the table, which I don't have, and anyway, so my goal is that maybe I can build that one, the first area. That just ended up being a bust simply because there was just so much for me to tackle. I did basically got a version of the dialogue system kind of working. Uh,
Well, you were excited about that in 2016. You were excited about Lumberyard's dialogue
yeah,
tools, the drag and drop
yeah, and
dialogue
and
logic.
so yeah, it was way friendlier than we're working out dialogue trees back in the day. Wish I'd had those kind of tools back then because it would have been much easier for me to kind of iterate through stuff and see, here's a problem with the logic in this dialogue tree, or here's how I can do X, Y, or Z with it. Um, and the other cool thing is I created riddle chests that were actually 3D chests. So you would move the tumblers and they're moving in 3D, and it was an actual physical object sitting out in space as opposed to there's some pixels and you click on it and then it takes you into a 2D interface. This was all something that worked within 3 space, and so I modeled it out and tumblers worked, and it was pretty cool. But anyway, so it's one of those things that I was having a lot of fun, but it was just the at the end of the time of the day, I had to make a decision about, well, I need to do things like, oh, I don't know, have some work that's paying me something,
Yeah, make
make
money.
money,
Yeah.
as opposed
Well,
to
and that's the thing. It's easy for fans, and I'm not dogging on fans, right? They're like, oh, I love Krondor. I like the stuff that Neil does. I want to play with
Mm.
this. I'm all excited. But it's easy to forget that, I mean, that takes a lot of work and you've got to make money and
Well,
live.
there's the
So,
living thing, and also just the practical situation is that, whenever people were asking me about it, it's like, if you got the license and you could do a remake? I said, if I were able to do that, um, keep in mind, so I'm doing this by myself, and it would take me, and I was just kind of thumbnailing it, 5 or 6 years probably to build
right.
all of Betrayal of Krondor with new tech. And of course, it's much more complicated because the textures are a lot more complicated. The buildings are more complicated. Everything is orders of magnitude more complex and detailed than what we did back in the day. And so, in order for me to do a true justice like that, it would be years of my life to do that. And I'm going to spend all my time on something that I can never possibly sell. And the second issue is that some of this boils down to people say that they want you to build a remake of Betrayal at Krondor, which is said, and which is shorthand for I would just like to play the same game but with prettier graphics and updated blah, blah, blah. But the reality of the situation is, if I were to actually go out there and do that and upgrade Betrayal at Krondor and try to bring it up to something that would, pass muster with people who like new computer games and make it a saleable commercial product, the problem is that no one would actually recognize it anymore, because I would be wanting to take advantage of changes in the way UI is developed. I would want to make changes in the way certain other things worked. And by the time you actually got it in your hand, it will be fundamentally different from Betrayal at Krondor. And it's not going to be this thing you love, because so much of what you remember about Betrayal at Krondor was that great game that I played when I was 13 years old. This was the coolest thing in the world. This was the first role-playing game to ship on CD-ROM, so it was really hot. And trying to recapture that particular lightning in the bottle, I just don't know that it's possible to do that. But and also at the same time, it's like, well, you go back and remake, Forbidden Planet. Why? Forbidden Planet's perfect. I don't want anybody to touch it.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
And so that movie is perfect. It doesn't need to be remade. Just tell people, go watch Forbidden Planet.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, I think that Betrayal at Krondor from 30 years ago is still perfectly playable. In fact, really surprisingly playable, like I said, because it was ahead of its time in many ways. So I'm not going to say it feels like a modern game, but it doesn't feel like here's an example. I love the gold box game, AD&D game,
Oh yeah,
Pool of Radiance.
yeah. Yeah. I love those little games.
I love it, but if you play it today, the UI problems are glaring, right? Because we've come so far with UI and how games work, and
we all learned
a more efficient way to figure out which spells you're going to memorize and all
we
that.
all learned how to make better UI. We learned how to do whatever. And
Right.
so the hard part is stuffing the genie back in the box and ignoring what I know. I've
Right.
seen this done better.
So, but out of nostalgia and because I love the game, and I still think it's a very good game, even with a UI from the 80s. When I go back and load up and play Betrayal at Krondor, which was 93, so 30 years ago, quite a while ago. Pool of Radiance came out in 85, 86, something like that.
I thought Pool of Radiance was before us, or 85. 85, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so let's say 85. I mean, it might be 87, it might be 80, but let's just say 85. So Pool of Radiance actually came out in 1988. I should have known that, but anyway, 1988.
Because I think the gold box one that shipped right before, while we were still in development, was Kryn. Was one of the Kryn games, I think.
Yeah, they did Champions of Kryn, and then they had 3 Kryn games. But the point is, when I fire up Pool of Radiance and I fire up Krondor, even though there's only a few years in between them, Krondor feels much more contemporary with how I control it and how I play it. It doesn't feel like the UI is in the way, right? I've still got to learn the UI.
Well, of course, Krondor is a 3D engine,
Right.
as opposed to a 2D engine, and so even though it doesn't graphically look as sophisticated as stuff that you play now, it still functions in the same way. Whenever you're moving through a 3D space, those same muscle mechanics still work in modern games as the way that we were doing them back in 1993.
Well, I'll even take you a step further. You have different functions when you click on an icon for right click and left click, which
yeah,
that's kind of an innovation. that seems obvious now.
Context, we have some kind of contextual kind of things. It's kind of funny because actually the first version of the interface that we did was a more generic looking interface. But one of the producers on the project that was John's boss, Bob Lindstrom. Bob Lindstrom basically said, you've got this game that's about magic and whatever, but you have a really not magical looking interface. And so he actually sent John back to kind of redesign the UI. And ultimately, we got the UI that you know now. And so the magic interface, for instance, is very different, and it has the cool kind of morphing, symbols.
Well, I was going to bring that up. I mean, that would even look cool today.
Mhm.
Like, because when you click with the different kinds of magic spells that you can cast, you get this almost vector object, glowing vector object that morphs to a different rune or a different shape, and it has different spells you can cast. And that's still, I mean, I was clicking on that just to make it change. I mean,
it was fun. Just
yeah. So for 30 years later, for that UI element still to be slick enough I just want to keep clicking on it to watch it change. Like, this is what I'm saying. I mean, Krondor
and something else
deserves the recognition it gets.
And this is hard for me to kind of remember whether this is true or not. And so take this with like large blocks of sand. I think we might have actually been the first game system to allow you to scale how much energy you put into a magic spell.
Oh, okay.
They were always.
We'd have to go look that up.
You would go. I mean, this is sort of us adapting like D&D mechanics. Where are you going to cast magic missile at level 1, level 2, level 3? That kind of stuff. And so there was the same mentality when we're thinking about the spells. I say, well, since we don't have levels, but we can still kind of say how much juice do you want to put into the spell. And of course, you're always risking, well, maybe it doesn't go off and you completely blow that. But I'm fighting a tougher monster, so I want to put more juice into the spell. And it costs you health, the more juice that you put into it.
Well, another thing that you did, and I know other games had auto combat. But what you do when you click on auto combat in Krondor is it plays out the combat for you. Whereas a lot of games, at the time would just jump to a screen and say, here's what happened. Right. So,
you want to watch it.
So you had AI in there playing out, and you got to watch what happened. And then you had one question I wanted to ask you, and then I want to move into actually what you're doing to celebrate the 30-year anniversary, because I know you've probably been asked these questions ad infinitum by people who are fascinated with the game.
It's all right. I don't mind. That means people care. That means people cared about it.
All right. Well, so when you say you were a level designer, basically scenario designer, you and John Cutter were working closely on a lot of the stuff, but you were writing story, developing scenarios. Like, does that include, I'm not talking about the puzzle boxes, which the puzzle boxes are still fun. I know you hear that a lot, but even though I knew it was coming, when I solved that first puzzle box, I still got a fun little dopamine hit. That was just such a great game mechanic.
Yeah.
And if people don't know, it's a box. It's called like a fairy chest or something, and it gives you a riddle, and then based on the riddle, you put in letters.
You have little tumblers. So if you think about a combination lock that you have that has little rotating tumblers where you put in different numbers, it's the same concept except they're letters.
Well, and I remember, I think it was Matt Barton said this. It may have been in an interview with you, our mutual friend Matt Barton from Matt Chat, game historian,
and your co-author.
I'm his co-author on Dungeons and Desktop 2nd edition. Yeah, that's fair. I was glad to be along for the ride, but I was definitely the co-author. But folks, you can get Dungeons and Desktop 2nd edition, the complete history of computer role-playing games. Go to Amazon. So, Matt Barton and Shane Stacks. I don't know why I said it like that when I'm
well, just because you're just like, hey, you can shill your stuff, man.
Yeah, well, it was like my voice changed though. I was like, hello, the book. Yeah. So anyway, but I remember him saying that like his wife or girlfriend at the time had no interest in computer role playing games, but she would come into the room because she wanted to be in on solving the puzzle chests because she liked that aspect of it. So that was just a fun little innovation.
Well, it's so funny because the number of times that we heard of some version of that story was that one person would be playing the computer game and then they would hear the music come on for one of the riddle chests, and so spouses, girlfriends, significant others, whomever would come running in and they wanted to be there to play with the chess. And so hands down, it's one of those signature things about the game that just became one of the things for us, is that people love those chests and those riddles and everything. So John is the person who designed the boxes, and then John and I feel bad because I'm blanking on a name, but there was another gentleman who was at Dynamics who actually came up, I think, with a good chunk, if not all of the riddles. Or actually, I did a handful. I know John did a few, but I think most of them came from this other gentleman, and I feel bad that I can't recall his name just at this instant. And then they're programmed by Timothy Strelchin, who was one of the programmers. And so it's extra kind of fun because I've been actually, in kind of lead up to the other things we're working on, I've been talking a lot with Tim Strelchin. So we kind of talked about building the boxes and everything. So, but yeah, it's one of the aspects about that game that was very unique. And it's just one of those signatures. When people talk about Betrayal at Krondor, one of the first things that people picture or imagine are those boxes.
Well, it was fun, because if you've played any computer role playing games or maybe even other types of games, when you first spot one, you're like, oh, it's a chest.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you get to it and it presents itself, you're like, oh no, what is this? So what y'all did, now they would say it's a mini game.
Yep.
But back then nobody called it that.
Mm-hmm.
You just put in a fun little game mechanic in there that was just fun. And it's one of those additive things because it's a multiplier. It's a multiplier for the fun because it doesn't have to be in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not central to the gameplay,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a lot of fun. And it, like you said, it makes it memorable. So it just adds to the overall.
Well, it was
experience.
another thing that John, whenever John was designing that system, that he was saying that one of the things that he really remembered most about playing D&D whenever he was a kid was having puzzles. And so we were always trying to find ways to integrate puzzles into the gameplay. And of course, obviously there were also, in some of the combats, we had these weird, what we call combat puzzles. Don't know if the combat puzzles honestly were as terms of, I think they were kind of an interesting idea. I don't know if the implementation came out as well as we wanted, but the puzzle chests were definitely something that worked really well.
Well, that's actually, it brings me back to my original question I was going to ask you about when you said, I say, hey, you're a level designer, da da da. So there, you're walking along the road, and then something starts that you think is going to be a combat encounter, but instead these little, almost like scepter-looking things rise up out of the ground.
Yes, it's part of
And
the.
it's a puzzle.
Yeah. We referred to those as combat. Referred to those as combat puzzles.
Okay, as combat puzzles, which I thought, I was like, well, that's pretty neat. That's what I'm talking about. Like, this game, compared to other CRPGs at the time, did a lot of bold stuff differently. Because it was like, oh, I have two sets of essentially goalposts, although they're not goalposts, and I need to move around correctly or they're going to zap me. And once I figured, I was like, oh, this is a puzzle, because I was trying to attack them, and this, and I'm like, oh, no, it's so. That was my original question. As a level designer, did you come up with any of those puzzles, or was that with somebody else?
No, that's all of that stuff. Pretty much all of the combat stuff was John. The only difference is like I sort of I designed sort of how some of the resistances were. So if you have this kind of weapon, this is the kind of armor that you has to go against it. So I did some of that design, but when it came to the combat and that system. So that's more systems related stuff, and that was all John.
Okay. All right. So I want to just tell people, remind people to go check this game out if you haven't. It's a very important part of CRPG history, video game history in a way. I mean, it won a lot of awards. It's a big deal, and it still has a pretty big legacy today. People still talk about it.
So
I guarantee you, this episode will get more than my usual traffic.
So I just want to kind of put this out there, and like I say, I'm not ordinarily someone who likes to spend much time sort of tooting my own horn about things, even despite the fact I'm on this podcast.
Right.
But this isn't about me so much as it is about the game. And a few years back, whenever I was trying to populate a panel that I was putting together, I was speaking to one of the co-founders of BioWare. And he told me that one of the reasons he founded BioWare was because he played at Betrayal at Krondor, and they wanted to make games like that.
That's quite a compliment, because BioWare went on to make some of the best computer role playing games out there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's a high compliment.
And so, like I said, that's just one of those things that I didn't know that back in the time, but it's something that he told me, and I was just kind of flabbergasted by that. And so, whenever I kind of think back, I said, well, how important was Krondor in the grand scheme of things or whatever? It said, if nothing else, it gave you the house that gave you, Baldur's Gate and gave you, all these other things. And it said it partially existed because they were inspired by playing Betrayal at Krondor and wanted to make games like that.
Well, then I could partially thank you for. So this is an ongoing thing with me and Matt Barton. His favorite CRPG of all time is Baldur's Gate 2.
It's a great game.
What, great game. I'm not. I think they did a wonderful job with it. I'm more of a turn-based tactical than I am real-time with pause. So that's my only beef with the not the Aurora engine, the Infinity engine. Other than that, love the Baldur's. I mean, they did a stupendous job. But my favorite BioWare game is actually Knights of the Old Republic. To me, that's one of the best computer role-playing games. The gameplay is good. They adapted the D20 role-playing game version of Star Wars under the hood. So it's got tabletop role-playing mechanics under the hood. And the story was far superior to the prequel stuff that came out.
Well,
although I do love the prequels because I'm a Star Wars nerd, right? But I have to admit that when KOTOR came out, the storytelling was so good. Like I remember thinking, like, why can't the movies have this storytelling? But anyway, that's just me. So we go back, but both of those are BioWare games.
Yep.
Right, and we're literally writing books about computer role playing games.
Yep.
So we have you to partially thank for that. Anyway, so I want to just tell people, great game, Neal. There's a reason why it's remembered so fondly, and we're about to talk about some stuff you're doing for the 30-year reunion, or not reunion, but 30-year anniversary, and it includes some get-togethers. So, but I wanted to ask you a couple of things related to the game, and give you a chance to throw out how people can keep up with you. First of all, and I don't know this, I think that you may be somewhat distantly adjacent to this question. I got it. I hang out on a Facebook group with like Matt Barton and some other people that are kind of in the video game industry. So I asked for some questions. I said, hey, do you guys have any questions for Neal? And, I'll make sure to credit you if I did it. So I got one from, there's a game journalist, and he writes books and stuff. His name is Matt Bradley. I think it's Sergi. It's TSHIRGI. So, but I think that's Sergi, if I remember right, or to Sergi. He asked, he said, did Raymond E. Feist, I guess he's doing a play on words here, feel a betrayal when Sierra went to have a betrayal at Antera as a solo game with the same engine as Krondor, but not having the Krondor IP. I'm not sure you're the right person to address that, but if you have any insight on that.
It's really funny that you bring this up. So I told you that Tim Strelchin and I have been having conversations because, of course, after we made Betrayal at Krondor, we had begun work on a sequel called The Thief of Dreams, and we were, I want to say, 3, 4, maybe even as much as 5 months into production on the sequel, whenever just out of the blue it got axed, and my team got broken up. They fired John. I mean, it was catastrophic. And of course, it made no sense because they couldn't really make the argument that we weren't selling that well simply because I actually have emails that were being passed back and forth between people at they're saying how well it's selling.
I've learned a long time ago not to try to make a lot of decisions that come from upper management make sense, because it doesn't seem based on the facts a lot of times.
So anyway, but so the project, at one point, after they made this catastrophic decision to break up the team and cancel the project, they actually came back to me. I'm all alone in my wing of the building. Because they've taken all the rest of my people and given them to other teams. And so there's a whole suite of offices, and it's sealed on both ends with a door. I'm the only person in this section of the office. And I've been there for, weeks trying to figure out, something else I can do, because it's like my job's on the line. I'm just surprised that they didn't fire me when they fired John, because all of the other games that were there that possibly could have needed writers had writers. So what was I going to do? But anyway, so the head of the company, Tony Rinke, came to me and actually proposed, well, Neal, what if we go ahead and we make the sequel to Betrayal at Krondor, and I'm going to put you in charge. And there's a whole political drama behind that. And I'm not going to go into that because it would take a half an hour by itself. But anyway, so...
Okay, could you give us, because there's people out there that are like, oh, they want the National Enquirer
here's the
headline.
Well, I mean,
so can you give me the headline or the elevator pitch?
This is the reason why I wrote Krondor Confidential, to kind of air some of this laundry. But so after they broke everybody up and they sent them off to different teams, Tony Rinke came back to me after a few months of me just going crazy. Do I have a job, doing whatever? Neal, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. And we have something for you. Well, that's all reassuring, but I'm coming to work every day, and I am spending the entire day at a whiteboard frantically trying to come up with a game idea that I think that Dynamics would be interested in doing. So eventually at one point I call Ray Feist, because I want to make sure that he knows all of this has happened, and and so he does know that John's been fired and the team's been broken up and there's no sequel on the plate. And he says, "Oh well, Neal, I know what's going on. They've got Rendezvous with Rama." And so I'm just like, "Oh my god."
That's a big book back at the time. That's a big
book. I mean, of course, I grew up with Arthur C. Clarke. I mean, there was the ABCs I grew up with: Asimov, Bradbury, and Clarke. And so this was somebody, because Feist was somebody that I was late in knowing anything about. But Clarke was somebody that had just been on my radar forever. And of course, Childhood's End, Rendezvous with Rama, and of course, 2001. All of these. I mean, this is the top of the masters of science fiction kind of heap here. And so the idea that I was going to work on this, and I got super excited about all this other stuff. Well, lo and behold, they didn't actually end up having it developed at Dynamics. They sent it up to Sierra to be developed. So I was super bummed about that whole situation. But anyways,
I bet.
So after this shift happens, then Tony comes to me and says, "Okay, Neal, I want you to go ahead. We're going to give you the reins. You go ahead and we'll have you make Thief of Dreams. But here's the condition: you need to make it in half the time and third the budget.
So nothing. So they see what I love how companies do this. They see what it takes to make a successful project, and then they give you conditions that are impossible to make that successful project.
Totally
I never have
impossible.
understood
And of course,
that.
also too, I mean, so there are a couple of levels of this. Number one is, okay, I'm a writer. I definitely cut my design teeth while I was working on this project, and I could do those tasks. What I was not experienced at is I had no experience being a project manager and really managing a whole team of other people, and certainly nothing that costs millions of dollars to produce. Of course, in this case, it would be
and let's not forget to mention that while you had your more limited duties on Betrayal at Krondor, you ended up being ordered by the doctor not to work for a week.
Yeah, and that
you were overworking yourself.
And also too, whenever people tell that story, I just want to make sure they understand that was my choice. I was the one overworking myself.
I'm not. But that was the amount of work that had to happen.
Yeah, well, that had to happen, and so. I sometimes people say, well, oh, your boss must have been terrible. No, my boss was awesome. He's the best, sweetest, dearest guy in the world. And so I would never want anybody to think that John was ordering me to do this. This was my choice. But anyway.
Well, let me tell a parallel story, and then we're going to get back to unfolding more of the National Enquirer story here. Okay. The guy that did the practical effects on John Carpenter's The Thing ended up in the hospital with exhaustion. Not because they told him to work to that level, but because he couldn't not work at that level. Like, he's like, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it like this. Yeah, right. Anyway, back to the National Enquirer.
Yeah, so, but anyway, so Tony Reinke hands me all this other stuff. Here are what I see as unwinnable conditions, because he hands me the folder that we have the budget, written out of what we had proposed that we were going to do. And this was after like a couple of different versions of kind of shuffling the deck chairs, because there were always concerns about how much the sequel is going to cost, because I think that John Cutter always said they think it's sort of like a factory, is that once you build the machine, then it's a lot cheaper to just stamp out widgets. And that was sort of the mindset with this, was the fact that, well, you've built it.
So they thought you already had an engine.
You built the engine, you figured that out. And so now stamping out widgets should just be super cheap. And of course, ignore the fact is that pretty much back in the day, whenever you built a game, you were almost always building a brand new stinking engine every time you built a game. You didn't go grab Unity. You didn't have, these Unreal. There wasn't like you were just grabbing a pre-existing engine and maybe tweaking it some. You were building this from freaking scratch every freaking time. And even though we were going to use, we started off Krondor with the Aces of the Pacific engine, or I think it was Red Baron, but Aces was in development while we were doing it. But even though we had that engine, once we put it on the ground, we had to make a lot of modifications in order to make it really work, properly. Anyway, so.
And by put it on the ground, you mean literally put
it on the ground. We're we're walking.
To let people move around on the ground with technology that was built for flying.
Yes, it was designed for flying around. And so, and seeing some objects close up that you're not really meant to ever see close up, or not been designed to be seen close up. But anyway, so you go do this, and so I'm looking at all this other stuff, and I'm not the greatest mathematician in the world to begin with, but I'm looking at these numbers and I'm trying to figure out, let's ignore the larger sort of aesthetic notion of, I think we've put out a game, it's winning all kinds of awards, it's selling well. And so coming out with a game that is smaller and less ambitious than the first game makes no sense whatsoever. You're going to ruin the reputation of the thing you just built. We do not want to be perceived as a bargain basement sequel to the first movie. And now, granted that Hollywood does this all the time, and that other gaming companies do this all the time, but to me, that was personally an insult. But
because they're trying to do a cash in on the name.
And so anyway, so I'm so if we ignore all of that, the objections I had at that level, said, okay, just practically speaking, can this be done? So I'm looking at all the numbers. I'm running all this other stuff. I said, there's just no way. There's no way that I can see that this can be done. So then I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to march upstairs to the office of Pat Cook. And Pat Cook was in charge of all of Dynamics' sports games. But Pat was also really good friends. He and John Cutter had worked together years before. And I knew because they were really good friends that that anything that Pat had to say, I would trust because I knew John Cutter would have trusted him. And Pat had, about 5 or 6, more years in game development at that time than I did. And he was a project manager. And so I figured, okay, so I'm going to lay this out in front of him, say, Pat, tell me, just look at this and tell me truthfully, if you got handed this same set of circumstances, could you make this game? Is this possible? And Pat was, Pat was a real, very straightforward kind of guy. Said, well, you know what, Neal, I'll tell you what, I'll take this home tonight and I'll look at it and come back in the morning and we'll talk about it and I'll tell you what I think. Okay. So I go home and I'm a nervous wreck all night long because I'm just like, how the hell, what am I going to do? But we'll see what Pat has to say in the morning. Maybe, it's not as bad as I think. And maybe if I can have Pat sort of mentor me some, I can make this happen. So go in the next day. And so one of the first things I was supposed to do is even before I went and saw Pat is that I was going to have a meeting with Tony Renke. But as it turned out is they decided that next day we were going to have a company meeting. And this was going to be our sort of state of dynamics speech that was going to take place. So Tony was actually busy getting ready for that. And in some respects, I was glad that wasn't going to happen because then I would have a chance to go talk to Pat. So go over to talk to Pat. And Pat is just kind of looking at me when I walk in the office. He said, Neal, you're not crazy. You're not crazy. It's just based on what is here. I would not try to make this game because with this budget in this schedule or whatever, you're not going to be able to make anything that's going to be worth damn. And I said, okay, on one level, I'm highly reassured that I'm not insane and that even though I'm not experienced with that, I could at least kind of perceive what was on the table. So, meanwhile, we're, we all have to wait until the afternoon whenever the all hands meeting is going to take place. So for this, they've rented a theater there in Eugene, Oregon, which is where Dynamics was. And so everybody shows up at the all hands meeting. And so Dynamics at the time had somewhere between 300 and 400 employees. And so we're all in this big movie theater down there for him to have this speech. And so it's pretty much what you expect. We go in, we're working on XYZ and everybody's clapping and really happy. And we just kind of go through all the different projects and sort of a general status of where everything is. So he's about to finish and then he pulls a Columbo. He said, oh, and one more thing.
Pulls out his little notepad, crumpled out of his crumpled trench coat.
One more thing. Neal Hallford has accepted my offer to become the head of to lead the sequel to Betrayal at Krondor. This is, of course,
and you're like,
and everybody turns around the theater, turns around and starts clapping and hooting, and because everybody's really excited because within the company we had everybody in the company were huge supporters of the game. And so everybody's just super enthusiastic, and I'm just looking at him because I'm standing in the back of the theater because all the rest of my team members are scattered with other teams, scattered through the auditorium. So I'm standing there by myself, staring at Tony Renke, just thinking, "You unbelievable bastard!" Because the thing about it is that you see this happen in books or you happen in movies, and you see this sort of political machination kind of stuff that's going on, and say, "I just lived through this." Because it wasn't even something that I entirely processed at the time, but as I got older, is just kind of seeing and said, okay, so here's the setup. Tony Renke had canceled our sequel. So now the things on the table were, gives it to me. I have no experience, and I will fail. So if it doesn't do well, it's all on this kid that I put in charge because I was still 26, something like that. Or or I decide not to take the gig and walk away and go, well, I tried to get the sequel made, but Neal, just walked away from it. So I'm just staring at him. I'm surprised my mouth wasn't just hanging open, or maybe it was. But I'm just staring at him, going, "Why did you do this to me?" Uh, and just realizing that this had nothing to do with me. This had to do with him being on the line about the sequel. So, and of course, if he was, had this whole situation with expectations about what was going to do, and again, half the time and a third of the budget, or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe it was, a third of the time and half the budget, whatever.
It was
But
unrealistic.
whatever it was not doable, not even remotely. And so I was left, and so I said, of the two options, to say, I could come in, I could try to make this game and fail, and then my name is on it at the top of the masthead. And I'm one of those people that says, I'm all up for a challenge, but if basically you decided I've struck out before I even get to plate, I'm not going to play. And
yeah, I mean, nobody likes to be set up to fail, and it's actually, in my opinion, good that at 26 years old, you had the presence of mind to at least understand that there was shaky ground in front of you. Because there's a lot of 26-year-olds that would have just gone for it.
And who knows what would have happened if I tried to do it, because even with Betrayal at Krondor, we were 7 months late and about $500,000 over budget by the time we shipped. And so maybe I could have kept playing for time. I mean, ironically enough, after I had my little experience of going to the hospital, Tony Remke came down to my office and said, Neal, this game will either succeed or fail depending on what happened, how people respond to the story. And kind of walked out of my office. It's just like, okay, first of all, I just got back from being in the, basically a week's leave from stress. Why the hell did you just say that to me? Because it's like,
why would you say
this
that?
gigantic project which cost $1 million or whatever, or at that point it was $1.5 million or whatever. But sure, Neal, you just went through all this stress and worry and concern about the game, and now you're going to come in and basically say whatever. And maybe he meant nothing by that or whatever. But again, considering the circumstances of what had just happened to me, and then I add that together with that little stunt, at the all hands meeting. But anyway, so all of that being said, this is all now prefacetory to the letter, getting back to the letter that Tim Strelchin and I were looking at. And this was a letter that was sent. I left Dynamics in April. I resigned on April 15th of 1993. In November of 1993, after I was gone, but Tim Strelchin was still there. And he was handed the fifth in a series of emails that was being traded between Sierra upper management and some of the people at Dynamics, which was all boiled down to the subject line of the email was Krondor got away. But what Tim was given was the fifth letter in the series, so he doesn't know what the previous four emails were in this chain. But the fifth one was them talking about, well, if somebody were to get their hands on the 3-space engine, how hard would it be? And I need access to all of Betrayal at Krondor's documentation, the design document, the story, all of this other stuff. And this was
sorry to interrupt you. What was it? Was the 3-space engine?
3-space engine. Sorry. So 3-space engine is the name of the engine that was built for the flight sims, and a modified version of that we used for Krondor. So that is the name of that game engine. It's 3-space. And it was developed by Damon Sly. But anyway, so this email was being traded back and forth. And so one of the people on the, I don't know if it was the person sending it or if he's at least in that list of names, is the guy who will become the person in charge of Betrayal at Antara. And this is something that gets sent in November. So 6 months after I leave Dynamics. So Antara gets developed.
Well, let's just real quick. What Betrayal at Antara was a game that came out that kind of used the same engine but had nothing to do with Krondor.
Nothing at all.
Right? Okay, but when you release a game called Betrayal at Krondor, and then the same company releases a game called Betrayal at Antara, I mean, there's some implied stuff there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they're fooling some consumers,
and I think that was entirely intentional. Sure. But after they fired John, after they broke up our team and everything, Ray yanked the license. And I think it particularly was associated with pulling John because he really loved John. He really respected John. And knowing that John wasn't going to be working on that and knowing that, we weren't going to be, I wasn't going to be involved with doing that, he yanked the license from them. And so they had no Midkemia license. And it's interesting that they were asking for the story doc. So maybe by the point, maybe at least in November, maybe they still had Ray's license. I'm not sure. What I do know for certain is that by December of that year of 94, I believe, or maybe it was 95. I'm a little fuzzy on this. Ray took the license and he gave it to a company in Los Angeles called Seventh Level. And so Ray called me and says, we've got the license there. Do you want to come and help develop a game at Seventh Level that will be in the same universe? Now, of course, there were issues of how much, because even though Ray had the license to universe, and so anything that we created at Dynamics Sierra Online, all of that stuff technically belonged to him because it's work for hire, but he didn't want to get into a sticky thicket in terms of conflict. So whenever we started at Seventh Level, he said, we basically had to kind of go back and say, we kind of need to just, so Owen can't come back. Any of the characters that were main characters in.
So you were at Seventh Level.
I was at the time. I was consulting. I'd moved back to Oklahoma for a while, which I'm glad I did because I got to spend some years with my dad I wouldn't have had otherwise because he died in 96. But he'd had cancer while I was in the later years while I was at Dynamics, and so I was glad that I came back. And ultimately, what killed him was not cancer. He survived that, but he had a heart attack out of the blue. But anyway, but I was back living in Oklahoma for a while. And so I was doing consulting work, which is kind of interesting because Seventh Level had 2 offices, one in Los Angeles and one in Dallas. The bunch that was in Los Angeles, or Seventh Level, was founded in part by Pink Floyd's producer. So that made for some interesting conversations. But anyway, I was involved. So they had a big meetup. So John Cutter, of course, he was working full time somewhere else, so he couldn't really be officially involved in any capacity other than maybe he'll consult a little bit.
Well, I love that, like, Ray somewhat was like, okay, if I don't like what you guys are doing, so I'm going to put together my own team.
Yeah, well, he just,
I mean, that's basically what he was doing.
He just basically said, you guys, screw the pooch. And so,
Right.
So I'm just going to try this again. And so he takes me down. And so we take to Bob Ezrin at Seventh Level. And we have a big kind of meeting of minds out in Los Angeles at the time it was the Ritz-Carlton, but it's now the Langham that's in Pasadena. And so I come out and we have a big 3-day kind of conference between myself, Ray Feist, John Cutter, and Bob Ezrin, and then the handful of people that were sort of the principals on the game at that time. And so my job was going to be, again, coming in, writing the story, consulting on design. And that was kind of an interesting thing because we actually sat down and because as opposed to John and I or whatever, the folks that were at 7th level that we were dealing with at the time, none of them had ever played a role-playing game before. Knew nothing about it. They did not have a 3D engine. And so the only game that they had done previous to this was a Monty Python trivia game. And so anyway, we it was kind of interesting.
Well, which now leads, I can't pass up this opportunity. So you were like, and now for something completely different.
Yes. But it was funny though, because we're sitting here. So, we came in and Ray is basically DMing a tabletop, game or whatever. I can't even remember now what the scenario was, but just so that the other people had kind of a handle on what traditional role-playing games were like. So this was 3 days in the area. At one point, we all went to a BattleTech center and played on the simulators there. Ray was getting a little frustrated simply because he's like, we really need to be talking about the game and some other stuff because, but Bob wanted to kind of go do these other ancillary things. But anyway. So I stayed on that project. So I made a trip down to Dallas and met with some folks down there. So it was just kind of weird though, because I had these 2 offices, and I wasn't entirely sure of which office was really running the show. And there was definitely some weird stuff that was going on that I wasn't really privy to because I was working out of my house in Tulsa. So anyway, after about 6 months, things were just, it was very clear that I was not connecting with the folks that were in charge there. And there was just a lot of tension about, how things needed to work. They had some very unrealistic expectations because they were just telling me flat out, oh, we're going to ship it in 10 months. I said, you don't even have a 3D engine. And, they said, oh, well, we've got all these people from Hollywood. And I said, you don't have a 3D engine. You can talk Hollywood all you want to, but that magic wand is not going to work. You need to have be thinking about the development of the engine, all this other stuff, and you're not taking this seriously. And so after about 6 months, I think we just basically decided to divorce. And
Right.
because.
So was Feist still in
Oh,
the
well,
picture at this point?
Feist was still attached to it and everything else. And I think he definitely might have had some hand in writing Return. Now, the interesting thing about Return is that, again, I did write the first run at the story for that. And so characters I created, and they still have me listed in the credits in the writing for Return to Krondor.
No, so was it originally going to be called Return to Krondor?
Yeah. Well, I don't even know if we titled it that, but well, here's the thing too, is so it lands at 7th level. It's in development there. Then it stays in development hell for about 4 years. And so one of the guys who was working on the project at 7th level, the guy who's the main guy in charge of it, has a heart attack. There's like a handful of like kind of big disasters that followed that sequel. So it moves from 7th level to, and I feel very, very bad because it's a very nice fellow by the name of St. John Bain, who took it to a second company. It was in development there. And then ultimately Sierra Online eventually decides to become the publisher of the sequel. Because it's been bouncing around for 4 years. And so now it lands back in Sierra Online's thing, even despite it's not developed at Sierra, has none of the same people involved other than my writing and like for a brief blink of an eye, John was on it for at the beginning. The only other kind of connection is Ray. But all of that said, even though we had some disagreements about some stuff, and to be honest, I'm not even entirely sure who was at that meeting whenever we were in LA, because there was a fellow by the name of Andy Ashcraft who I think is the person who started the design, and I don't know if he followed and went with where St. John Bain was, but Andy Ashcraft and St. John Bain, they both seem like really nice guys, and whatever tensions or whatever stuff that was going on, I hold neither of them in any ill of either one of them. Certainly don't feel it toward Bob Ezrin, who's a sweet, super cool guy. But the tale of that sequel, which became the official sequel, because if you look at it now, you'll notice it's in the same logo. It's produced by Sierra Online, so you'd think, oh well, they produced. This is since this is the one that shows up with the Krondor Association or the Betrayal name on it. Or it has not the Betrayal, but has the Return to Krondor name on it. But so people who are outside were just like, oh well.
You're credited as a writer on Return
I am
to
right.
Krondor.
I am. Yes. So they did keep some of the elements of my story that are in there, and also there are elements.
When you say elements of your story from Thief of Dreams or from?
Well, from the because I wrote the initial treatment for Return to Krondor, or what became Return to Krondor. And so, but also some of the stuff that I had written for Thief of Dreams also kind of turns into stuff in Return to Krondor. It is not the story, because the story that you would have been handed in Thief of Dreams follows Owen. Because I had in mind a trilogy that was going to be about Owen in sort of his path. And so there are elements of that story that do come back. One of a villain that's kind of mentioned in passing and is in sort of an important subplot in Betrayal at Krondor, the Crawler, and the Thieves Guild, that shows up in Return to Krondor, and the Crawler becomes a major villain in Return.
Okay.
But and also too, the characters of Abbott Graves and Cat also were in the Thief of Dreams would have been major lead characters in Thief. But in Return, I think my big contribution to Return to Krondor was the character of Jazhara. But fun fact, Jazhara is actually named in tribute to a character named Jazz out of the novels by Brian Lumley, which is a fantasy horror series. But anyway.
Yeah, you're talking about the Necroscope
Yep,
stuff?
Necroscope, and Jazz shows up in like book 4 or something. But anyway, I like the name, and so Jazhara was partially inspired by the character of Jazz in Brian Lumley's Necroscope. But
well, let me do this, because that was, I'm sure that Matt Bradley Sergi, who asked that, is going to love that you went to that level of detail.
And it had far more to do with Return than it did to like I say, other than like I say, is just so I speaking to how Ray felt about it. I can't.
Did you ever catch a whiff?
We never really discussed that, because honestly, that was going on under the radar. I knew nothing about it until after it released. So Ray and I never discussed it.
Just me trying to put myself in his shoes.
Yes.
Which, him, I've never met the guy, but if I was somebody who was an author and my friends, people had bought the rights and made a game called Betrayal at Krondor, and then that same company did weird corporate stuff, which companies tend to do. I still haven't figured out to this day why corporations act the way they do, but they completely dropped the ball, flubbed it. He yanked the rights, and then they come out with a game called Betrayal. I'm sure there was part of me was like,
it's hard for me to say, because I'm not inside Ray's head, and I can't say for sure. But if I had to speculate, this is purely speculation, but I would say is that along with being a writer, Ray is a consummate businessman. And probably if Ray was thinking about it, he said, it's the right business decision for Sierra to have made. Ray always respected money. And he
Hold
respected.
on. Come here. My cat is meow. I'm just going to let him meow. Earlier, I kicked him out, but I'm just going to let him hang out. So if he meows, he meows.
But
so for you, Ray, not Ray, I'm calling you Ray now, Neal, and the listeners at home, if you hear my cat Buster meow, then he's just.
I can start meowing if this is just for.
You want to just meow? Well, he's a loud meower. He's a very loud
well, I'm not
meower.
hearing it on my end, if that means anything.
Okay, well that's good. Well, sometimes he cranks up like he's having an existential crisis, and I haven't quite figured out but it'll be like 3:00 in the morning, and he's just yowling, and I'm like, dude. Or I'll be in a work meeting or something. He'll crank up. So,
but anyway, so like I say,
anyway,
so don't in terms of don't take this as this is something Ray told me, but I'm just saying if I had to get inside of Ray's head, Ray is a business person, and he probably looked at that from the standpoint of it's the smart move for Sierra. He would probably do the same thing under the same circumstances. That is as much as I could possibly probably say, because again, we never discussed this, so I don't truly know. But if I had to speculate, that would be my speculation.
All right, fair enough. Well, it was a good question. I actually, when I first read that, my inclination was to think that you were going to go, I don't really know. I can't really speak to, but instead we got this wonderful anecdote and story and video game history. So I appreciate that very much.
That it's like, if you ask me a question, I'm going to tell you something.
Yeah, no, Neal gonna talk. Neal got stories. Okay. So thanks for the question from Matt Bradley. Sergi, actually, I have a couple of questions here that have popped up from Matt Barton as well.
Hi,
and this is going to be unfair to you because I'm going to say, hey, here's a really interesting question, but we can't talk about it very long. So he's explaining to people in the chat room who may not be as familiar with your history that you wrote a big book about CRPG design. Was it Swords and Circuitry? So he says it has a lot of interviews, and he said, and this is from Matt Barton. He says, I wonder how much of what he wrote back then still would apply to modern CRPG engines and so on and so forth. Would any of his advice fundamentally change if he wrote a new edition? Seems like there'd at least be need to be some consideration of crowdfunding and app platforms, I think, in VR. Mm-hmm. And then likewise, might be interesting to hear his take on open licensing and whether you're better off just coming up with your own versus working with an established system or franchise with Krondor. So that is like, those questions there are a whole podcast.
20 questions buried in that one question. But
so you've got, I mean, unfortunately,
no, that's fine. I can actually answer that pretty quickly. So really quickly, Swords and Circuitry, a Designer's Guide to Computer Role-Playing Games, is a textbook that my wife and I co-wrote back in 2000. And we were really lucky. It went out. It became a textbook in some colleges, and I still have people who will write me and say, I found a copy of the book. I'm just, really excited about it, and it really affects me. And so the interesting thing is the number of people who are designers who bought it, who are actually working in other genres, and say a lot of the same advice applies to the things they're working on, even though it was a specialty text written about development of role-playing games, for computer role-playing games. They said they had lessons that helped them work on other titles. And so I'm really glad that people enjoyed it and they found it useful to them. But would I change it? Absolutely, there would have to be things that would change, because first of all, there are a lot of interviews that are back and said, unless you have someone who is a vintage role player, that isn't going to, those wouldn't necessarily be of interest to somebody who says, I'm trying to develop for a game for right now and not for 19, or for 2000 or whatever. So number one, I would probably replace most, if not all, of the interviews with interviews with writers behind but behind titles that have shipped in the past dozen years at least. The other thing is absolutely there have been huge changes in the technology. I give in Swords and Circuitry, we just kind of give a very passing mention to multiplayer. Simply because number one, multiplayer is not something that was hugely on my radar because I was developing single player games for most of my career before that. And so multiplayer was still kind of developing in terms of for the role playing audience. And of course now it's the whole thing. And of course MMOs were just starting to kind of come in and really make a real impact around the time I wrote the book. The only MMO that I really cover in the book was Ultima Online. But we've since had well, actually, I think that's the only one that we covered in the book, and so obviously we've had EverQuest and World of Warcraft and every other big RPG, MMO RPG under the sun that's kind of developed. So I would have to spend a lot of time talking about the influence of those. Some of the storytelling has changed. So absolutely, yeah, it would be hugely updated. And of course, so the answer to that is the original book was 500 pages or more long, and so one of the reasons I haven't gone back and done a read update because I don't know that I really want to sit down and write another 600 or 700 book right now. But and also too is that I wrote that at a time in which there was very little on there were a handful of titles that were out there that were about game design, but pretty much all the books that were available were largely about programming. And even whenever we went to Prima Publishing, who was the original publisher of that, most of the books were writing Lua code, writing how to create a 3D engine, how to do whatever. And so we landed at Prima, and so we were the only title, and we were kind of a specialty title, not even just game design, but game design for computer role playing games. Which, the argument I made is they are the most complex form of game out there from a standpoint, because you have all these moving parts that you don't have to mess with in other genres. That's my opinion. Some other people would feel differently, but I personally think that RPGs are the most complex kind of games to build and to test and to implement. But yeah, so it would be a very different kind of book, and so every once in a while I'm insane, and I said maybe we should write Swords and Circuitry too. And so probably we would write it as a sequel rather than a complete update of the original book, because so much of it would fundamentally change that it turns into the ship of Theseus. And so okay, what's changed in the past half dozen years or so? But the main thing that I think that comes through in that book is I spent a lot of time talking. There were very few books at the time that really dove into storytelling and design. That you might have like a little bit of a half a chapter or something that would talk about it, but Swords and Circuitry really spent a lot of time talking about storytelling, world building, a lot of stuff that was kind of considered soft science among the other titles that we were with. And of course, it just drove me crazy because it's a weird book, because you're not going to learn a single line of code while reading that book. You would always get stuck in the computer programming section. And I always said you really should co-shelve this in science fiction and fantasy, because this is as much about world building and storytelling as it is about
the actual
about coding. A lot of this is about philosophy of building games and sort of wrapping your head around it, thinking about the marketing aspect. So anyway, yes.
All right. Yes. So the short answer is yes. The long answer or the longer answer is yes.
I would just say that the stuff that we get changed would be the things that are no longer technically relevant.
Right. The technical aspect has moved on. So, yeah, you got to remember, like, the computers that we were using back in the 80s and 90s, the desktop computers were the flip phones pre-iPhone were more powerful in some ways. So yeah, maybe not graphics wise, but in other ways with like processors and stuff. So anyway, all right. So it's the 30-year anniversary of Betrayal at Krondor.
Yes.
and you have a lot of you have a contest and at least 2 different celebration events. And I will have links for all this stuff in the show notes at shaneplays.com, folks. So you can go to shaneplays.com and look for the show notes for today's or for this episode, not today's episode, for this episode. We're recording on the 10th. Your contest kicks off on the 11th. This episode should be in the next week, be out in the next week or so. And so there'll be a couple of months after this drops for people to get in on the contest. So there's still plenty of time. You sent me a thing called Linkorama, an email called Linkorama, and it has a tremendous amount of links and information in it. Folks, go to shaneplays.com, look for the show notes, and you'll find all this. But probably the most important link that you need to know is Krondor FFC.com. Krondor FFC.com, and that stands for, I think, Fan Film Contest or Fan Film Challenge, one of the two. You can also go to Neal's blog at nealhallford.com, and that's Neal for Neal, Neal, Hallford, HALLFORD.com. So nealhallford.com or KrondorFFC.com. Those 2 links will probably get you where you need to go. But Neal, take it away. What all you got up on the plate here?
So on June 23rd, which is the 30th anniversary of Betrayal at Krondor, I'm going to go up to Eugene, Oregon, and we're going to get together with as many of the developers who are able to come and join us. So far, I have 5 people confirmed from the original development team who are going to be with me, and we're going to have a party at the McMinimans North Bank. They're in Eugene, Oregon. And so this isn't just for the developers. This is for fans of the game. So all the super fans that want to come up and join us. I have some folks flying in from Florida, people driving up from Northern California. And we have a handful of other people that are, talking about coming in from all kinds of crazy different places for this. So whenever we first started talking about this was just going to be kind of a dinner that we were going to do there at McMinimans. And so we started talking about, well, this is the 30th anniversary. What can we do to make this kind of this celebration, get together, meet up, whatever you want to call it, have something kind of really interesting and sort of bonus things for people to see or do. So we were talking about the fact that the other thing that I do that I have 2 different people in my life who know me for different things. There are half of them that know me for being in game development, and the other half of me that know that I'm an independent filmmaker. And I said, this is a perfect opportunity for me to fuse both of those things together. So, starting tomorrow, we have opened up a contest on Film Freeway, and it's called the Betrayal at Krondor Fan Film Challenge. And your objective, should you choose to accept it, is to make a 3 to 5 minute fan film that is related to the content in Betrayal at Krondor. Now, this could be, I'm going to reenact, because there are lots of little cutscene kind of things that are happening in the game, and so reenact those, but with like real actors and with sets and costumes. We think this will be a lot of appeal to cosplayers. If you want to make an animation, you want to animate something, if you want to use 3D tools and kind of create something, but it has to be something related to Betrayal at Krondor. But that said, you can have some fun with it. One of the things we were kind of joking around, and I was talking to my wife Jana about this, and she said, "Well, how about it's Betrayal at Krondor, but it's a 70s buddy cop movie." So Locklear and Gorath and Owen are and I said, well, it works out perfectly too, because Locklear already has a porn stash. So
so as long as it's a parody spoof is
acceptable. If you want to make a music video, if you want to redo some of the theme music from the game, or you want to write an original song that's about playing Betrayal at Krondor, that would be acceptable. Something else.
So I've already got what I'm
Okay.
going to do. Okay, you ready? I've got it concepted. I've already walked around with the little thing that you look through and it makes it look like that you're looking at the
Mm-hmm.
movie camera, the dimensions. I've already done. I've got my beret. I've got my megaphone that we talked about earlier. I've got it
Mm-hmm.
storyboarded. I've got the little
Mm-hmm.
clapper, the act one,
Mm-hmm.
scene one,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So when you kill somebody in Betrayal at Krondor, they just lay there in a lump with like their robe over
Mm-hmm.
them or something. So I'm just gonna have somebody film me laying in the road for like 5 minutes.
Well, let's say anything like I said, any take that you would have on, as
Yeah.
long as it has something to do with the
Well,
content of
here's
the
how it
game.
ties. One, because
Yes.
bodies lay there, and even after you loot them, you'll come walking back by and they're still
Mhm,
laying there. But two, I'm gonna have somebody walk up and touch
mhm.
my body, and then the little script's gonna pop up and go, Owen felt kind of bad about looting Kane's body, but he didn't really need the stuff anymore. So
All
that's my
right.
fan
All
film
right. Well, like I
concept.
say,
All right.
but
Yeah.
so like we don't really care about the genre. If you want to do a romance, if you want to do comedy, you want to do horror, but it just has to have a connect. It needs to be related to the content.
It has to connect to not just Krondor, not just the novel. It's got to connect to
Betrayal at
Betrayal at
Krondor
Krondor.
is specifically.
So what if I have somebody follow me around with a camera and I just randomly knock on doors?
Again, if you want to do that and you kind of tie it to like act out the scenes when we're opening up the doors or whatever, I like I say, you just
Yeah. No, I was being
well,
facetious because that's one of the game
oh,
mechanics. You
see,
just
the
go
thing
up
about
and
it is
knock
the
on
things that
random
I've
doors.
learned
But
over the years of
yeah,
being associated with different film
yeah,
festivals and stuff is you never, you can talk
yeah.
about all kinds of weird concepts, but you really know what it's not, don't know what something is until you actually do it, and something might sound really stupid or weird, uh, and it'll come out really well. So who knows? I mean, that's as valid a place to start as a lot of other things that I could think of. So
All right. So anyway, a 3 to 5 minute fan film somehow
so
connected to
somehow
Betrayal at
connected to
Krondor, but that you're
and go ahead.
but it has it you but they can be
Well,
creative in what that
and that's the thing
connection
is too.
is. It doesn't have to be like dressed
No,
up exactly like they could recreate scenes, but like you said, they could have the 70s buddy cop. They could have Krondor
exactly.
Vice and everyone's in Miami in the
Exactly.
80s.
And
Yeah, I
so
got
and
you.
so just
Yeah.
we just are encouraging people just be creative because the part that's going to make this really fun is that well obviously we already made the game and we made those little cutscenes and so just exactly duplicating those things that might not be as interesting as doing an all new take of it or see what happens after the camera stops rolling in those various scenes
Right.
but
Right.
whatever you want to do. So drama, comedy, whatever, all of those things are valid. The other thing that you can that you're welcome to do is that if people want to submit like a mini documentary about how Krondor impacted them in their life, I've had over the years various people contact me and tell me that Betrayal at Krondor was how they learned English. Um, is that that they learned to play or they learned English because they were playing Betrayal at Krondor, and so this is how they taught themselves English was playing Betrayal at Krondor, or at least that was the motivation for learning English was so they could play Betrayal at Krondor. And
So they could
so
play the
I've
game.
had other
Um,
people, tell me very emotional stories. I have one friend of mine. I won't name her just to protect her identity a little bit here, but she after
all right, I'm giving a spoiler warning here for something that Neil's about to say related to an important plot point in Betrayal at Krondor. Normally, I wouldn't give a spoiler warning for a game that's 30 years old, but I'm also encouraging people listening to this podcast, if they haven't played it, to go play it. So, with that in mind, if you don't want any spoilers, jump ahead about 30 seconds. I'll even give you a little time to think about it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You have been warned.
after the end of the game and after Gorath dies, sorry, spoiler, uh, um, that after Gorath dies, she cried for hours and hours, after this, and like locked herself in the bathroom. And she was so emotionally shattered by what happened to Gorath. Um, and so, and again, at one level, I feel terrible making this little poor teenage girl cry. But the flip side of the coin is we touch people. We really, it was an
Right.
emotional thing for me. And it wasn't about, rage quitting. It wasn't under those circumstances. It's a very cinematic kind of end.
Oh, there. I ended up on some Reddit forum the other day talking about Krondor or Betrayal at Krondor specifically. They were discussing. It was from a while back. They were discussing your personal project when you were doing some of the remastering, playing around with that, and they were talking about what the really strong, super strong point of their point was, we don't need a remaster because what was so strong is the story. So again, kind of touching on that your writing, was kind of the core of the game in a lot of the ways. So even though that guy was kind of jerky when he walked in and said, "Yeah, this will live or fall by your writing," I mean, he was right.
horrible timing. So I'm gonna go back to never mind me. I'm going back to the emergency room.
Yeah.
But
Right.
anyway, but there's a lot of stuff that's, I mean, they made a whole freaking movie out of Battleship, right? So,
Sure
so,
They sure did.
So, Betrayal at Krondor, there's a lot of fodder, lots of opportunities, because there's a lot of stuff that only ever appears as
Right.
text.
All right, there's your
And-
challenge, folks. If they can make a movie out of freaking
Yes.
Battleship, you could do a fan film with all the richness that is Betrayal at Krondor.
And it's only 3 to 5 minutes long.
I have to say, yeah, 3 to 5 minutes long. And it's between tomorrow, March 11th, and May 12th, which is basically 2 months. It sounds like to me like you're totally fine with people recording it on their phones or something. Like it doesn't.
We encourage people to use their phones, because one of the other things that I do is my wife and I have Swords and Circuitry Studios, which is our production company, and we sponsor a film festival here in town called the International Mobile Film Festival. And all the movies that show up in this film festival, it's run by our good friend Susie Bateo. But Susie Patello, all of the films that appear in the film festival are all shot on mobile phones. We have features, we have shorts, and this is the 13th year this year of this particular film festival. And so we have some folks who you might have heard of. Tim Russ actually came down for a film that appeared at our festival that he's in. And then a couple of years, the year after him or a year before him, 2 of the actors from Lord of the Rings came in, and they were also in The Hobbit. They came down with a film from New Zealand with something they shot on a smartphone. And so there are some really incredible stuff being made on smartphones. You probably don't know it. Like half the ads you see on television right now are all being shot on smartphones.
Yeah, because they've got the
And
cameras have gotten so good.
there are several big directors that are saying we're just going to start shooting on smartphone.
I watch a lot of found footage movies. A guy shot a found footage movie on his iPhone called The Unwelcoming House. And I know that some people look down on found footage, they're not hard to make, whatever. But the point is, cinematography wise, you would have had no clue it was shot on a smartphone. And the only reason I knew is because I went and looked up the movie. I think I either read about it before I watched it or went and looked it up after. I have an entire page on shameplays.com where I track all the found footage movies I watch, and it's up to like 120 something. But yeah, he made it. You wouldn't know it was shot on a smartphone. So
yeah, it's just like that whole world has hugely changed, and the fact that as my friend Susie is always saying, is that all of you are carrying a movie camera in your pocket every day.
Well, in some cases, a movie editing studio.
Yeah, a movie editing studio, because you can because there are last year is the first time that we had a film that it never moved off the phone. She shot it on, it was a great film by our friend Jennifer Zhang, and Jennifer shot it, edited it, everything about it was done on the phone, and it's a spectacular short.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And so actually it wasn't last year, it was the year before last, but she came back this last year to be a judge. So anyway, there's some just amazing stuff out there and some amazing tools out there. And so I think the main thing is just use your creativity and, realize it's like, I'm not going to be able to shoot Battleship on my cell phone. But maybe you could just blow up everything.
Let me just say that as a guilty pleasure, like I'm catching this on late night cable.
Oh yes,
Battleship is a fun movie.
It is.
It's a completely ludicrous setup.
Yeah.
And they took that board game, but it's a fun.
It's not going to win an Oscar, but it was
no,
fun.
but it's a fun guilty pleasure sci-fi action movie. So
yes, but I just I poke fun at that because people talk about story time. He said so the next thing is going to be Minecraft the movie or whatever.
Yeah, well, I remember fake movie posters for Hungry Hippos, the movie, and stuff like that.
Or Minesweeper. There we go.
Minesweeper, the movie.
But anyway, but everyone's walking around all the time with a movie phone or movie camera in their pocket, and there are tons of apps that are available. And if you hop online, there are lots of places that you can find information about making indie films, particularly making them with phones. And I think the main thing is you just kind of think about, figure out what story you're going to tell in your 3 to 5 minutes, and don't worry if it doesn't look like Steven Spielberg.
Right.
If you can figure out how to
Spielberg
achieve
had
that,
to start somewhere. So
yeah. Well, the thing about it is in some respects, I kind of love it because it's almost like going back to the Super 8 camera I had when I was a kid. Because I was one of those kid filmmakers running around making useless crap whenever I was a kid, and nothing ever really amounted to anything. But again, I didn't. The movie Super 8. I watched that movie. Said this movie's about me, except I didn't have his friends.
And you also didn't have the alien monster. But
other than that, that was aggravating because it's like there was me and I was the kid running around with the camera, but I didn't have any cool friends that would help me make my movies. But I was hugely into that stuff, and there used to be a classic magazine that was made for people who are making movies themselves in their backyards called Cinemagic, and it taught you everything you needed to know. And so there was a whole and Steven Spielberg started with Super 8mm camera in his backyard. I think same thing is true with George Lucas. And so you never know where this is going to go. You might decide that you really dig this and you start doing films on your own. But this is a great place to start. You're going to be in a thing with other fans, and so our main expectation is just have fun and communicate that fun to us. To the audience.
So there's actually judges for this.
Yes.
Hey, folks, again, go to Krondor ffc.com, and that's got all the information you need. Where you can go
we'll have the rules that are all and that stuff that's on there.
It's got all kinds of stuff. But there's judges. You're a judge. Your wife Jane is a judge. Susie Botello from the International Mobile Film Festival is a judge. Bonnie Gordon from Star Trek Prodigy.
Yes.
I'm guessing is she a voice actress on Prodigy?
She plays the computer on Star Trek.
Okay, and then you have 3 mysterious secret judges that will be announced soon. So this is going to be judged.
I have one person who I have asked, who I have a feeling might join us, but I'm not going to jinx it yet by saying that he will, but I think he probably is. I will say it is an individual that is involved with probably one of the largest fan film things that are out there, and I'll just leave it to that for now.
There's going to be judges. There's going to be all kinds of cool stuff. These films are going to be shown at the Get Together in Eugene, Oregon. The dates, let me throw the dates out here again for everything. March 11th, that's tomorrow for me and you, Neal.
Yes.
Probably be a few days in the past when this podcast drops. That's the opening date for the Betrayal at Krondor Fan Film Challenge. May 12th, so roughly, 2 months, is the close of submissions for the Betrayal at Krondor Fan Film Challenge.
So I just want to say, the submissions will all happen on a platform called Film Freeway.
Right.
If you go to the URL that he's talking about, KrondorFFC.com, there is a link from there to Film Freeway. And so once you are done with your film, click on the link, go to Film Freeway, and you can submit there. And you could also do it directly, but you have to type in the URL exactly, because we're considered an online film festival, which means you can't just search on Film Freeway site and find us. It's basically considered a private event.
Okay, so go to Krondor FFC.
So just go to KrondorFFC.com, click on the link to Film Freeway, and that will take you directly there. That's just an important point I want to make sure that everybody knows and understands.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, so May 12th closes submissions. Go to KrondorFFC.com, then click on the link from there to Film Freeway and submit your movie, because you're not going to be able to go to Film Freeway and search for directly where to upload it. June 23rd, which is actually the 30th anniversary of the release of Betrayal at Krondor, there is a 30th anniversary party in Eugene, Oregon, which is where it was made. And then on June 24th, there's an online Betrayal at Krondor, because Neal's a smart guy. There's no moss on Neal. He knows that not everybody can get to Eugene, Oregon. So
I'm expecting it. All of you are coming.
Yeah, everybody. Yeah, why you even listen to this if you're not going to Eugene, Oregon on June 23rd? Well, for those of you that for some reason the authorities prevent you, the online Betrayal at Krondor 30th celebration is happening, and there's a road trip to Powell's. So tell us a little bit about this June 24th thing.
Yeah, so on June 24th, we are going to have an online event, and so the plan is that it's going to probably be on Twitch. We are planning sometime during May to have some kind of, so we have, starting tomorrow, we have the fan film challenge. Well, sometime in May before the event, we're thinking about doing some kind of gaming challenge on Twitch. That's related to Krondor. We're still trying to figure out exactly what form that's going to take. But anyway, on the 24th, we want to kind of, first of all, announce the winner of that particular winner from the Twitch Gaming Challenge. We're going to show the official selections, which are the probably somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes of films that we've chosen as the best of the crop from our fan film challenge. And then we're going to have, if filmmakers, if we can get a Q&As with them, or at the very least a pre-recorded message about why they decided to make the film they made, and that sort of thing. Any developers that are willing to join us and hop on, and again, we may have some pre-recorded stuff, but just depending on who is capable and interested in joining us. I'm going to see if I can get Ray to at least tape a message. If not, I actually invited him to the event. Unfortunately, he's going to be on the East Coast whenever the get-togethers get. So he won't be at the party, sadly enough. But he was invited.
All right. Well, that's cool.
And so we're going to do all of this online stuff, and maybe we'll show some gameplay. But that's just going to be a celebration of anything and everyone and anything associated with Betrayal at Krondor, and that's happening on the 24th online. Again, it's probably going to be some form of Twitch thing, but where that's going to happen, we don't have nailed down. I've had discussions with Kilgore Trout, who is one of the official streamers for GOG. And so maybe we associate, maybe we can do this in association with him, but I don't know what his schedule.
Kilgore actually escaped the pages of who wrote Kurt Vonnegut.
Yes.
The character actually ripped himself out of the pages, and he's running around in the real world.
Yes, well, yes. So he's Kilgore's one of the major streamers that get on and stream various different games. He has on his show several times streamed Krondor back to front.
Nice.
And so he's a big fan of the game. And so whenever I first was talking about the anniversary thing, he just said, "Let me know if you'd like to do something special for this." And so, let's say, so I've got a lot of moving parts in association right now with the online thing because there's a lot of possibilities about what to do. And so we're just going to figure out is what is the form and the location that makes the most sense.
Okay. And then finally, what's the road trip to Pals all about?
So the road trip to Pals, and so whenever I was living in Eugene, Oregon, so what my job at Dynamics really was paying for my book buying habit at Powell's.
Okay.
And so Eugene, Oregon's about 120 miles, 100 miles or something south of Portland, and so Portland is where Powell's Books is, and Powell's. For anyone who does not know, is the largest independent bookstore in the world. It takes up an entire city block, is 5 stories tall, and when you walk in the front door, they hand you a map. That is a bookstore. Powell's Powell's is amazing. If you love books, as strangely enough, someone like myself does, then this is definitely the place. And
so do they have used books too, or is it all new stuff?
Well, I think most of the stuff is actually used, but
I love a used bookstore.
These are used books that you don't know are used books. These are in exquisite conditions. Whenever they get stuff that they give to them, the shabbier stuff, they kind of sell off to smaller bookstores. And so I bought so many used books there that looked like they were brand spanking new.
So, how do you envision this road trip to Pals working? Just a bunch of people like caravanning up there?
What I'll do is that we'll just kind of figure out. Said this is when we're going to leave, and we're going to meet up at Powell's. And so if people want to follow us up, but we're not going to do a big formal event because Powell's is not expecting an invasion. I don't really even know how I would heard that, but I'm just saying that if people want to go up and see this bookstore, I will be happy to kind of lead the expedition.
So
up
from
there.
June 25th and afterwards, everybody at Powell and Haunting Tones will say, "We don't mention Betrayal at Krondor."
We do not say the name.
We do not say the name.
It would be kind of funny is I might even say, we'll have to see. I might contact someone there and say, hide a copy of Betrayal at Krondor in the store, and so you have to find it. Of course, in that case, it'd be Krondor the Betrayal, but find Ray's books or something. I don't know.
Right. See if you could find whoever brings me a copy of the book.
Yes, bring me.
Bring me the head of Feist. Yes. I mean, bring me a book of Feist.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
But anyway, it's just a magnificent bookstore, and I'm only half joking whenever I said pretty much every other weekend I drove up to Powell's, and so this is part of, if you want to get close to the making what it was like to be inside the thing. Well, this is me following me to Powell's Books. Right.
You're giving people a little slice of Neal's life during the time.
Earlier I mentioned the name of Chris Mettinger, so Chris was a really good buddy of mine and lived just down the balcony from me at the same apartment complex. We had our birthday parties together, and he and his girlfriend are the ones that kept me alive after I got sent home for a week, and because I had to go to the emergency room. So anyway, Chris would frequently go with me up to Powell's, and so I remember, you will kind of particularly appreciate that. So one time we were on the way up there, and so I had Mark Ukran's Learning How to Speak Klingon on audio tape, and so we spent the trip up and back, trying to learn how to speak Klingon. Anyway, so that's what that will be all about, or at least something along those lines.
Oh, I was sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I was riffing on the Klingon thing.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I had myself on mute for some reason. No, I love that. All right, man, I got to do this. I got to wrap us up. We're at 2.5 hours. And I appreciate your time so much. As always, it's been a great conversation. So Folks, again, March 11th is the opening date for the Betrayal at Krondor Fan Film Challenge. May 12th is the close of submissions for the Betrayal at Krondor Fan Film Challenge, which will the films will be judged and shown at the Betrayal at Krondor 30th anniversary party in Eugene, Oregon on June 23rd. Then June 24th is the online Betrayal at Krondor 30th celebration and the road trip to PALS, where you may or may not learn Klingon there and back. Go to KrondorFFC.com. KrondorFFC.com. That's your main point of contact for all of this stuff. And then the blog at nealhallford.com. Would you say that those two places are the best places to stay up to date on? Okay.
Yes.
So check all that out. All right, Neal, I've got to end on the bad joke of the week.
All right.
Has to happen. All right. So I've got some jokes here. We'll see how many we get through. I decided to go with knock jokes. So, all right, let me see. Here's one in celebration that spring is coming. You ready?
Okay.
All right, knock.
Who's there?
Hatch.
Hatch who?
Bless you.
Well, you can do this because you're a dad, so it is a dad.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, the worse the better. No, they're supposed to be bad. All right. How do cows stay up to date?
I have no idea.
They read the moose paper.
Mm-hmm.
Are you like me that if you're driving and you see a cow that you have to moo at it?
I moo at it, or you have to point and say cow.
Yeah, cow. That's very important. My son and I have gotten to the point where if I forget to moo at a cow, he will give me a ticket on the drive. He will find a piece of paper and give me a ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Knock.
Who's there?
Nobel.
Nobel who?
Nobel. That's why I knocked. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And finally, I got a couple more here. All right, here we go. All right. Will you remember me in a minute?
Okay.
Would you remember me a minute from now, Neal?
Sure. I'll remember you.
Will you remember me in a week?
Of course.
All right. Okay. Knock.
Who's there?
You didn't remember me. All right. And then finally,
yes.
Knock.
Mm-hmm.
Knock.
Who's there?
Water.
Water who?
What are you doing participating in such terrible jokes? That's the bad jokes of the week. Okay, Neal, thanks so much, man. I always love having you on. Love all the shenanigans that you're up to. I hope everything goes well with your celebrating Betrayal at Krondor. Betrayal at Krondor, man. Mm-hmm. Do you remember Krondor Man? That
Krondor Man.
Mm-hmm. Krondor Man. I used to have that poster up on my bedroom wall.
The other guy on Buck Rogers in the second season, was it Condor?
That was Hawk. That was Hawk.
Okay.
Hawk. Yeah, when they completely revamped the show and turned Wilma Deering into a stewardess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when they went on The Searcher and they put her in like a stewardess outfit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, she went from being like a military colonel to basically a stewardess on a space airliner.
Yes.
So you tell me. I loved Buck Rogers growing up. I still love it out of nostalgia.
Oh, sure.
But when I watch it now, especially the second season, I'm like, what were they doing?
Mm-hmm.
So,
but I'll watch it anyway because Aaron Gray.
Yeah, I mean, right. No moss on Neal.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is the first season had a better setup.
Oh yeah, well,
the second season they put them on the Searcher and sent them off, and it was just what are they doing?
Somebody basically always said is that, so the second season they decided to make a really bad version of Star Trek.
Yeah, but it was like, let's take Star Trek and let's have some of the core characters taking care of passengers like they're on an airliner.
Yes.
They literally had a set that was like airline seats.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
And they put Wilma Deering, they were like, well, she's a glorified stewardess now. I don't know what they were thinking.
Well, it's just like all of
Anyway.
these, over the years, just weird random retcons the series. It was like the second or third series of War of the Worlds that was on Fox on Fridays. And, it was like the first season or two, they're preparing for the aliens to invade. And then that next season, then suddenly war's already happened. They've taken over the Earth.
Right.
They're renegade fighters, and it totally feeling different show. But anyway.
Well, I get that. Like even the old Wonder Woman show, they suddenly jumped from
Oh yeah,
the 40s to the 70s. But my thing and so I get that it's like, hey, we got to retool this. It's not quite working. But they went in such a crazy direction with the second season. All right, I got to go, man. Neal, you rock.
Thank you.
I hope everything goes good. I might actually put in a film. A fan film for you for your challenge there.
I want see this. Please do that because I would really love to see. And like I say, I would tell all your people is that I really want you to just be creative about it, but don't worry about if this is not you're not going to win an Oscar off it. And don't worry about it. We're not expecting you to.
Just have fun.
Have fun
and connect it to Betrayal at Krondor somehow.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, you survived the bad jokes of the week. You regaled us with, you know how to tell a story, man. Like, you just naturally know how to tell a story. And I always love listening to you and listening to your tales in your adventures. So, and I wish you well. Wish your sweet wife, Jana, well with her. I know she's doing some scholarly pursuits.
Yes.
So wish her well. And, thanks for the time. With the before we started recording and including recording, we've been going for like 3 hours.
Yes.
And neither of us, we haven't taken a drink break. We haven't used the bathroom, nothing. We've just been going. So if you've been sitting there like dying for a drink or jumping back and forth because you need to use the bathroom, I apologize. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.